When Good Morning Britain interrupts its regular programming to announce that 50 Labour MPs are turning against their own Prime Minister, and it would only take 80 to trigger a leadership challenge, you know someone's political career is circling the drain. Welcome back to UK Political Insight, where GMB just delivered another devastating blow to Keir Starmer by revealing that 50 Labour MPs have signed a letter condemning his decision to block Andy Burnham, calling it a remote stitch-up from a small group of people at the very top in London. And we're now just 30 signatures away from a potential leadership challenge. The reporter even said it seems Starmer's already accepted he may lose the Gorton and Denton by-election, that blocking Burnham was choosing the lesser of two evils, because having Burnham in Parliament would be even worse. And viewers are absolutely destroying Starmer in the comments, saying he's Labour's last hope of salvation wasted, that this government is the chaos they voted to escape from. This is a prime minister in crisis being dissected on breakfast television while the entire country watches. Let's break down this spectacular political meltdown. So, Good Morning Britain, one of the UK's biggest breakfast shows with millions of viewers, interrupted its programming to announce that Labour MPs are turning against Keir Starmer. That's the kind of coverage you get when a story's genuinely significant and developing fast. GMB doesn't interrupt for routine political disagreements. They interrupt when something major is happening that the public needs to know about immediately. Reporter Louisa Games shared that 50 Labour MPs have expressed their anger over blocking Andy Burnham and have written a letter to the Prime Minister and the NEC calling for a review. 50 MPs. That's not a handful of usual suspects from the awkward squad. That's a substantial chunk of the parliamentary party organizing in opposition to their own leader's decision. And they're not just grumbling privately. They're putting their names to a formal letter demanding a review, which is about as close to open rebellion as you get without actually launching a leadership challenge. Charlotte Hawkins described this as a critical moment for the country and the Labour Party, which is not hyperbole. When your own MPs are organizing against you, when letters are circulating, when breakfast television is covering it as major breaking news, that's a critical moment. Starmer's leadership is being tested, his authority is being questioned, and the outcome could reshape British politics. The letter's argument is straightforward and damning. It says there's no legitimate reason why Andy Burnham shouldn't have the democratic right to put his candidacy to local people in Gorton and Denton. That's the democratic principle at its simplest. People should be allowed to stand for election, and voters should decide. By blocking Burnham at the NEC level, Starmer's denying that basic democratic process, and the MPs are calling him out for it. The letter continues with the political reality check, pointing out that polling clearly shows Burnham may be Labour's very best chance at winning the by-election. That's MPs telling their own leader, based on evidence, that his decision makes losing more likely. They're not speculating. They're pointing to polling data that suggests Burnham would perform better than whoever else Labour selects. Ignoring that data because you're scared of having a rival in Parliament is putting personal interest above party and electoral success. Then the letter delivers the really devastating critique, saying the decision denies local members real choice and only reinforces the idea that politics is a remote stitch-up from a small group of people at the very top in London. That phrasing, a remote stitch-up from a small group at the very top in London, is the exact same language the local Gorton and Denton activists used in their letter. This is coordinated messaging, multiple groups using the same powerful framing to maximize impact. And it's effective framing because it taps into deep frustrations about how politics operates. People feel disconnected from Westminster. They feel like decisions are made by a small elite without their input. They feel like democracy is performative rather than real. When Labour MPs are saying their own leader's decision reinforces that perception, they're accusing him of embodying everything voters hate about politics. Louisa James then dropped an absolute bombshell by revealing that the names of MPs who signed won't be made public, but there are currently 50 signatures and it would only take 80 to trigger a leadership challenge. That's enormous. We're 30 MPs away from the threshold for a formal leadership contest. 30. That's not a distant possibility. That's uncomfortably close to reality. The fact that names aren't being made public is strategic. It protects individual MPs from immediate retaliation while still applying collective pressure. Starmer can't single out and punish specific rebels if he doesn't know who they are. But the number of signatures becomes public knowledge, which creates pressure and shows the scale of opposition without exposing individuals. The revelation that we're 30 signatures from a leadership challenge will dominate political coverage and create its own momentum. MPs who might have been hesitant to sign now know that enough colleagues share their concerns that a challenge is becoming plausible. That could encourage more signatures, which brings the total closer to 80, which makes the challenge even more plausible, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. But here's where Louisa James delivered the most significant political analysis of the entire segment. She said it seems Keir Starmer and those around him have already accepted they may lose the Gorton and Denton by-election, and the alternative of having Burnham in Parliament would have been even worse. That's a reporter on national television saying the Prime Minister is already written off this seat, that he's chosen to probably lose a by-election rather than risk having a leadership rival back in Westminster. Think about what that means. Starmer's calculation, according to this analysis, is that losing to Reform UK in a Labour heartland is preferable to allowing Andy Burnham to become an MP again. That's putting personal political survival above the party's electoral success and above defending against Reform's insurgency. It's the most cynical possible interpretation of his decision, and Louisa is presenting it as the most likely explanation for what's happened. The phrase, "the alternative would have been even worse," is damning because it confirms that this decision was about protecting Starmer from a leadership challenge, not about party resources or sensible electoral strategy. The worse alternative isn't losing the seat, it's having Burnham in Parliament building support for a challenge. That's Starmer prioritizing his own position over everything else, which is exactly what his critics have been accusing him of. Louisa's final point is that whether or not this letter makes any difference today, it adds to the fact that Starmer is very unpopular with some of his MPs and feels very vulnerable in his position. That's a breakfast television reporter openly discussing the Prime Minister's vulnerability and unpopularity within his own party. That's not normal political coverage, that's crisis coverage, and it signals to millions of viewers that Starmer is in serious trouble. The viewer reactions shared on X are absolutely brutal and representative of broader public sentiment. One viewer compared this government to the previous one, saying both seem incompetent at best and worryingly corrupt at worst. That's the nightmare scenario for Labour, that they're being seen as just as bad as the Tories they replaced. The whole point of the election was that Labour would be different, competent, trustworthy. Instead, they're delivering civil wars over candidate selection, plummeting approval ratings, and breakfast television discussing leadership challenges. The third comment is perhaps most devastating. Andy Burnham should have been allowed to stand. He was Labour's last hope of salvation. Instead, Starmer is clinging on to power in the knowledge that the majority of the UK not only dislikes him, but he is such an ineffective Prime Minister. I won't give him my vote again. That's a voter who presumably supported Labour, who now thinks Burnham was the party's last hope, and Starmer has destroyed that hope by blocking him because it threatened his personal position. And they're saying explicitly they won't vote Labour again. That kind of voter disillusionment is politically fatal because it doesn't just affect one election, it creates lasting damage. Once voters decide you've betrayed them or proven incompetent, winning them back is incredibly difficult. If significant numbers of Labour voters feel like this commenter does, Labour is in for electoral catastrophe. The phrase "last hope of salvation" is religiously loaded language, suggesting Burnham was the one person who could save Labour from disaster, and Starmer has rejected that salvation because it threatened his personal position. That's not just political criticism, that's moral condemnation of a leader putting self-interest above the greater good. Good Morning Britain covering this story with this level of detail and urgency means it's broken through from Westminster bubble news to mainstream public awareness. Millions of people who might not follow politics closely are now hearing that Labour MPs are rebelling, that a leadership challenge is mathematically close, that the Prime Minister is vulnerable and unpopular within his own party. That kind of coverage damages Starmer even if no leadership challenge materializes, because it establishes in public consciousness that he's weak and under threat. The timing is also terrible for Starmer because he's literally about to leave for China. He's going to be on the other side of the world while this story dominates domestic news, while the letter campaign continues, while pressure builds. He can't respond effectively from Beijing. He can't do the backroom politics necessary to shore up support. He can't personally reassure wavering MPs. He's trapped by his own schedule. The fact that GMB felt this was significant enough to interrupt programming suggests their political team thinks this is a genuinely major development, not just routine Westminster drama. Breakfast television doesn't interrupt for minor stories. They interrupt when something major is happening that the public needs to know about immediately. If you want every update on whether more MPs signed the letter pushing it closer to the 80 needed for a challenge, whether Starmer's China trip becomes a disaster as this escalates at home, whether the Gorton and Denton campaign becomes the catastrophe everyone is predicting, whether GMB continues covering Labour's civil war as major breaking news, subscribe to UK Political Insight right now. We're posting multiple times daily because this story is moving incredibly fast. Hit that notification bell so you catch every development instantly. Drop a comment predicting whether we actually reach 80 signatures, whether Starmer survives this crisis, whether Labour loses Gorton and Denton to reform, proving all the critics right, because I genuinely want your predictions before the situation develops further. Until next time, keep watching breakfast television interrupt programming to announce your Prime Minister is in crisis. Keep questioning how someone wins a landslide and 6 months later faces potential leadership challenges. And remember that when you're 30 signatures away from a formal challenge and your own MPs are calling your decisions a stitch-up, you're not in control anymore. You're in survival mode. This is absolutely gripping political drama, and it's far from over.